The dress they gave me was the color of ash. Not silver, not gray. Ash. The kind left behind after something has burned completely, when even the memory of warmth has gone cold. It had been my mother's once, or so my stepmother claimed whenever she needed the cruelty to sound noble. It was hers. You should be grateful we let you wear anything at all. I stood before the cracked bronze mirror in the servants' quarters, a small, dark room that smelled of tallow candles and damp stone, and tried to find something worth saving in my own reflection. My dark hair, at least, was clean. I had spent the better part of the afternoon carrying water up from the well, bucket by painful bucket, just so I could wash it properly. My hands were still red from the cold. The dress hung loose across my shoulders, the hem uneven, the lace at the collar yellowed and brittle. Someone, I suspected Mira, my stepsister, though she would never admit it, had pulled 3 of the buttons from the back so that I would need to walk with my spine unnaturally straight just to keep the fabric from gaping open. It was a masterpiece of quiet cruelty, the kind that leaves no mark. Outside the narrow window, I could hear the entire estate stirring. The royal gathering of moons came only once every 7 years. When the Alpha King of Aldenmore opened the gates of his castle to every noble house in the kingdom. It was not a celebration in the way common folk imagined celebrations. It was a reckoning, an accounting. The Alpha King, it was said, used the evening to observe the houses, to measure loyalty, to identify threats, and, if the rumors held any truth, to consider the question of an alliance through marriage. Not that such a thing was ever spoken plainly. In Aldenmore, power moved like water beneath ice, always present, never visible. My stepmother, Lady Corvith, had spoken of nothing else for 3 months. She was a woman built for rooms like this one, tall, polished, relentlessly composed, with eyes the color of winter bark and a smile she deployed like a blade. She had married my father when I was 9 years old, 2 years before he disappeared on a campaign to the northern borders that no messenger ever returned from. After that, she became the estate. She became everything. Her daughters, Mira and Sela, had spent the past week being fitted, perfumed, and adorned. I had spent that same week carrying their bathwater, pressing their gowns, and hunting for a missing ribbon that turned out to be tucked deliberately beneath Sela's pillow. No one asked what I would wear. Not until this morning, when Lady Corveth appeared in the doorway of the kitchen where I was kneading bread and said, with the kind of lightness that costs nothing, "You'll come, of course. Every household member must attend. The summons was absolute. You'll wear your mother's old dress." Then she was gone before I could form a single word. I understood, without needing it explained, what the dress was meant to accomplish. Arriving at the royal gathering in rags would mark me. It would tell every noble eye in that hall exactly where I stood, below the servants, below consideration, somewhere in the dust beneath Lady Corveth's polished heel. She was not keeping me invisible. She was displaying my invisibility as a trophy. I breathed in slowly and pinned the back of the dress as best I could, with a thin copper clasp I found in the pocket of my winter coat. It wasn't beautiful, but it held. The journey to Castle Aldenmore took the better part of 2 hours by carriage. I was not permitted to ride inside with Lady Corveth and the girls. I sat with the driver on the open bench, wrapped in a wool cloak that smelled of horse and old rain, watching the road unspool before us in the blue-gray light of early evening. I did not let myself feel it. That was something I had learned early. How to fold the feeling small, press it flat, and put it somewhere it would not interfere with the business of surviving. My mother had called it keeping your fire banked. You didn't let it go out. You didn't let it rage. You simply kept it, quietly, for when you would need it most. The castle appeared first as light. From the valley road, it rose against the darkening sky like something that had grown from the mountain itself. Towers of pale stone trailing banners the deep blue of midnight, hundreds of torches blazing from every parapet and gatehouse arch. The drawbridge was down and wide, the courtyard alive with the sounds of horses, harnesses, distant music from somewhere within the great hall. Even from here I could smell wood smoke and roasting meat, and the particular sweetness of beeswax candles burning in quantity. I had never seen anything like it. I had lived my whole life in the provinces, in a house that had once been fine and was now simply old. I knew the rhythms of village markets and traveling merchants, and the occasional feast day at the local chapel. I did not know this weight of grandeur, this castle that seemed to breathe with a power entirely its own. The driver helped me down from the bench with a brief, kind nod that I would remember long after the evening ended. We crossed the courtyard with the other arriving households, and I fell into step 3 paces behind Lady Corveth, where I was expected to remain. The great hall of Castle Aldenmore was vast in the way that made the air itself feel different, colder, more formal, charged with something I could not name. The ceiling soared into shadow above iron chandeliers dripping with candlelight. The floor was pale stone, smoothed by centuries of footsteps. Along the walls hung tapestries depicting battles and hunts and the sigils of the great alpha houses, wolves, bears, ravens, and something older that I couldn't quite identify at the far end, something with wings folded like a cloak. Lords and ladies moved through the hall in clusters, voices low, eyes busy. I recognized the social architecture immediately, even if I had never witnessed it at this scale. Who stood at the center of a group, and who orbited the edges, who was being watched, and who was doing the watching. Lady Corveth drifted toward a cluster of noblewomen with practiced ease, Mira and Sella close at her heels, like 2 well-dressed shadows. I stopped near the entrance and simply stood. No one looked at me. The dress, the ash-colored nothing dress, worked exactly as intended. I was furniture. I was the stone floor beneath their dancing feet. I pulled the wool cloak tighter and let my gaze travel the room with the quiet focus I had developed over years of watching from the margins. That was when I saw the throne. It sat elevated at the far end of the hall on a dais of dark stone, flanked by 2 stone wolves the height of a man, their carved eyes facing the room with an expression somewhere between guard and warning. The throne itself was old, not ornate in the way of wealth, but worn in the way of use, of genuine power lived in rather than performed. And sitting in it, or rather leaning in it the way a man does when he has never needed to perform relaxation because stillness comes naturally to him, was the Alpha King. King Orion of Aldenmore. I had heard descriptions, of course. Everyone had. Broad-shouldered, dark-eyed, cold as the northern pass. The whispers around him were always slightly afraid, which usually meant they were slightly inaccurate. People described power the way they described weather, in terms of what it had done to them, rather than what it actually was. He was younger than I expected. That was the first thing. Not young. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of campaigns and grief and long nights of decision, but not the ancient, immovable force the rumors suggested. He sat among his Gamma advisors and Beta commanders, with the ease of a man who had long since stopped needing to prove anything to anyone, which was perhaps the most quietly intimidating thing about him. He was not smiling. He was watching the room, and then, in the way that sometimes happens in crowded spaces when you are the only one standing perfectly still, his gaze moved across the hall and stopped. On me. Not on Lady Corveth, who was performing graciousness with expert precision 6 paces to my left. Not on Mira, who had laughed loudly at something and then immediately composed herself. Not on any of the polished, prepared, perfumed daughters of noble houses who had trained their whole lives for exactly this room. On me, in my ash-colored dress, with my copper clasp, at the edge of the room, standing like someone who had wandered in from the cold and hadn't yet decided whether to stay. The contact lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then a beta commander leaned in to say something at his ear, and the Alpha King looked away. And I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. I told myself it meant nothing. A king's gaze sweeps a room. That is what kings do. It was coincidence. It was nothing. But my heart was still knocking unevenly against my ribs as the music swelled, and I could not quite convince the feeling to go flat. The evening moved the way formal gatherings always do, in slow, deliberate circles. Lords greeted lords with the careful warmth of men who do not trust each other. Ladies assessed each other's gowns with smiles that never reached their eyes. The beta commanders stationed along the walls held their expressions neutral, but their attention never stopped moving, scanning the room with the practiced vigilance of men trained to find threats in ordinary things. I had drifted further toward the eastern wall, where a long table held pitchers of honeyed wine and platters of bread and roasted meats. Not because I was hungry, though I was, genuinely, having given my midday meal to the stable boy who had helped me load the carriage that morning, but because the table gave me something to stand near, a reason to be somewhere. In rooms like this, a person without a purpose became a question others felt entitled to answer for you. I poured myself a small cup of wine and held it without drinking. From this position I could see the whole hall clearly, which was, I had long since learned, one of the few genuine advantages of being overlooked. No one guards their expressions around furniture. Lady Corveth had secured herself a conversation with Lord Aldwyn of the House Fenrath, a stout, red-faced beta lord with more land than sense, according to the estate's old steward, who had once served my father and sometimes still spoke to me as though that mattered. She was leaning toward him with her particular brand of focused attention, the kind she reserved for men she wanted something from. Mira was dancing. She was beautiful when she danced. I would give her that. Tall and fair, with the fluid ease of someone who had never spent a morning kneading bread. She moved through the steps with practiced grace, and I watched 3 different young lords angle themselves closer to her without quite realizing they were doing it. Sela stood at the edge of the dancing, watching Mira with the tight expression she wore when she was pretending not to want the thing she wanted most. Sela was 2 years younger than her sister, and had never quite forgiven the world for making Mira first. I turned my attention back to the dais. The Alpha King had descended from the throne. This surprised me, though I wasn't sure why it should have. He was moving through the hall now, flanked by 2 Gamma guards who tracked his movement like shadows, close enough to intervene, distant enough to allow the impression of accessibility. He stopped to speak with a cluster of lords near the center of the room, and I watched the way the group physically reorganized itself around his presence. Subtly, instinctively, the way iron filings align themselves near a lodestone without being told. He was taller than I had registered from across the room. His tunic was dark wool, simply cut, with the silver wolf sigil of Aldenmore at his collar. No excess ornamentation, nothing that needed to announce itself. His dark hair was cropped close at the sides, and longer at the crown, and his jaw carried the kind of set that suggested he spent more time making difficult decisions than easy ones. He laughed at something one of the lords said. The laugh was brief and genuine, and it changed his face entirely, opened something that the stillness kept closed. I found myself staring and immediately looked away, back to my wine cup, which I still had not drunk from. "Stop it," I told myself firmly. "He is a king. You are wearing a dead woman's dress with a copper pin holding the back together. Look at something else." I looked at something else. Specifically, I looked at the woman who had appeared at my elbow. She was perhaps a decade older than me, with the kind of face that is not beautiful in the conventional sense, but becomes more interesting the longer you look at it. Wide-set amber eyes, a nose that had been broken once and healed slightly crooked, dark skin weathered by sun and wind rather than sheltered from it. She wore a beta's badge at her shoulder and carried herself with the compact, watchful ease of someone who spent a great deal of time noticing things. She was looking at me with open curiosity. "You're not with any of the court clusters," she said. It was not an accusation, simply an observation, offered the way you might comment on weather. "No," I said. I'm with the House Corveth household. Lady Corveth's daughter. Ward, I said. The word had a particular flatness to it that I had never quite managed to sand smooth. I am her ward. The woman absorbed this without visibly reacting, which I appreciated. I'm Dessa, she said. Gamma rank to the King's Council. I spend most of these evenings making sure no one poisons the wine, which is less dramatic than it sounds, and more necessary than anyone admits. Despite everything, I felt the corner of my mouth move. Willa, I said, I spend most of these evenings being invisible, which is less peaceful than it sounds, and more exhausting than anyone would believe. Dessa smiled, quick and real. You're doing it wrong then. Being invisible? Standing at the edge. She nodded toward the center of the room. The edge is where people come to avoid being seen. The center is where you actually disappear. Everyone's looking at everyone else. No one has time to wonder who you are. It was unexpectedly sound advice. I turned it over in my mind the way you test an unfamiliar path with your foot before committing your weight. I'll remember that, I said. Dessa glanced toward the dais with the brief, practiced look of someone checking a fixed point of navigation. Then she looked back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Enjoy the evening, she said, and moved away into the crowd with the quiet efficiency of water finding its level. I stood with that for a moment. Then I moved toward the center of the room. It was a small act of defiance against no one in particular, or perhaps against the version of myself that had spent years accepting the space she was assigned. I found an open stretch of floor near one of the great iron candle stands and stopped there, watching the dancing, holding my wine, breathing evenly. That was when Mira saw me. Her eyes found me across the floor, and her expression shifted in that particular way. The tightening around the mouth, the brief flare of something behind the eyes that she covered quickly with a smile. She excused herself from her dancing partner with a grace I genuinely admired, and crossed toward me with the unhurried certainty of someone who has never had to rush to make a point. You look cold, she said pleasantly. The hall is warm, I said. That dress? She continued, glancing at it with a small sympathetic tilt of her head. Was never very well made, was it? Even when it was new. Mother said it was your mother's. But honestly, Willa, I think she was being kind. I held the wine cup steadily. Probably, I agreed. Mira blinked. She preferred it when unkindness landed. You shouldn't be standing here, she said, dropping the pleasantness like a mask set aside indoors. In the center. People will wonder. Let them, I said quietly. It was not something I had planned to say. It arrived from somewhere underneath the banked fire, carrying more heat than I intended. And Mira heard it, really heard it, because her chin lifted slightly and her eyes went cool. Mother will. Mira. We both turned. A young man had appeared behind her, beta ranked by his badge, with sandy hair and the awkward, earnest expression of someone who had rehearsed an approach 3 times and was now abandoning all 3 versions at once. He was looking at Mira with the painful transparency of a person who has not yet learned that hope should be kept closer to the chest. Would you honor me with the next dance? He managed. Mira's attention swung to him like a weather vane catching wind, the irritation smoothing immediately into warmth and welcome. She forgot about me entirely between one breath and the next, which was, in its own way, the most honest thing about her. She left. I exhaled. And then the music stopped. Not gradually, the way a song ends, but suddenly, every instrument dropping into silence at once. The kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses against your ears and makes the room feel smaller. Every head turned toward the dais. The Alpha King had returned to the elevated floor before his throne, but he was not seated. He stood at the edge of the dais with his Gamma guards flanking him at a respectful distance, and he was looking out at the gathered hall with the patient stillness of a man who knows the room will settle without him needing to demand it. When the quiet was complete, he spoke. His voice carried without effort, not loud, but structured somehow, shaped by the stone of the hall into something that reached every corner without strain. "Lords and ladies of Aldenmoor," he said, "I thank you for honoring the gathering of moons. Before the evening closes, I will meet with each house's senior representative in the Eastern Chamber. The order will be called by my Gamma Council." Murmuring moved through the crowd like wind through grain. Private meetings, assessments. Additionally, he said, and something in the word's particular weight made the murmuring stop again, "I have a request to make of this hall." The silence stretched. "I would ask to be introduced to the young woman in the ash-colored dress, who has been standing near the iron candle stand for the past quarter hour." The silence shattered into something else entirely. Every head in the room turned. The movement was almost mechanical. All those polished, practiced faces swiveling in one direction. Toward me. I stood completely still, the wine cup in my hand, aware in the most acute and terrible way of every loose thread on my hem, and every minute of labor that had produced this nothing dress, aware of Lady Corveth somewhere behind me making a sound I could not yet hear over the rushing in my ears, aware of the distance between where I stood and where the Alpha King of Aldenmoor was looking directly, without question, without confusion, at me. I did not move for what felt like a very long time. The hall had reorganized itself around that single sentence, the young woman in the ash-colored dress, the way water reorganizes around a stone dropped into it, rings of reaction spreading outward. The lords and ladies nearest to me stepped back, not away from me exactly, but sideways, creating a channel between where I stood and where the Alpha King waited at the edge of the dais, as though the hall itself had decided to make a path whether I wanted one or not. Dessa appeared at the edge of that channel, her amber eyes finding mine across the candlelit space. She gave me the smallest nod, not encouraging, not alarmed. Simply, "This is real. Move." I moved. Each step felt strangely deliberate, the way steps do when you become aware of them, when the ordinary mechanics of walking suddenly require conscious instruction. The stone floor was smooth and cold beneath my thin-soled shoes. The candlelight felt heavier here, closer, as though it had opinions about where I was going. I was aware of every face I passed. The open curiosity of a younger lord, the sharp assessment of an older lady, the barely concealed astonishment of a beta commander who had probably never expected the evening to produce this particular development. I did not look for Lady Corveth. I already knew what her expression would be, and I did not need it in my peripheral vision right now. I stopped at the base of the dais steps. Up close, King Orion was even more difficult to look at directly than he was from across the room. Not because of beauty exactly, though there was that, but because of the quality of his attention. He was looking at me the way people rarely look at other people, completely, without the usual performance of looking. As though I were a document, he was reading carefully, rather than a person he was assessing for social leverage. I met his gaze because looking away seemed worse. "Your name," he said. Not unkindly, simply directly. "Willa," I said. My voice came out steadier than I deserved credit for. "Willa of House Corveth, my Lord King." Something moved briefly across his expression. Not quite a frown, more the subtle recalibration of someone adjusting a calculation. Ward or daughter? The question landed like a small stone in still water. He had either already spoken to someone, or he was simply precise about the distinctions that mattered. Either possibility was unsettling in its own way. "Ward," I said. He was quiet for a moment. The hall around us had achieved a particular quality of silence that I recognized from the moments before weather breaks. everything held, waiting. "Walk with me," he said. It was not a question, but it was not quite a command either. There was a space in it, barely perceptible, where refusal might have fit if I had been someone who could afford one. I climbed the 2 steps to the dais level and fell into pace beside him as he turned toward the eastern corridor. His Gamma guards adjusted their formation smoothly, flanking at a distance that was close enough for security and far enough for the appearance of privacy. Behind us, I heard the hall exhale, and then immediately begin talking, a wave of whispered commentary breaking like a tide against the stone walls. The eastern corridor was quieter. Torches burned in iron brackets at intervals, throwing warm, unsteady light across walls hung with maps of the kingdom's territories, borders drawn and redrawn in different inks over what looked like many generations of decision. The air smelled of old stone and beeswax, and something faintly resinous, like pine sap. Orion walked at an even pace, his hands clasped behind his back, and for a stretch of corridor neither of us spoke. I found, to my mild surprise, that the silence was not uncomfortable. It had texture rather than pressure, the way silences do between people who are both genuinely thinking rather than simply waiting for their turn to speak. "How long have you been in the Corveth household?" he asked eventually. "Since I was 9, I said. "My father was Lord Arveth of the Western Province. He was lost in the Northern Campaign 11 years ago." Arveth. He said the name with the deliberateness of someone locating it in a large internal map. The third wave, if I remember correctly. His company covered the retreat at the Grey Vein Pass. I stopped walking. He stopped too, and turned to look at me with that same direct quality of attention. "You know of him," I said. It came out slightly uneven. "I know the campaign records," he said carefully. His house was absorbed into Corveth after his disappearance. The estates were transferred. He paused. "Were you aware that transfer was irregular?" The word irregular settled into me strangely, too precise, too calm for what it was suggesting. "I was 9, I said. I was aware that everything changed and no one explained why." He studied me for a moment. "You have been in that household for 11 years, he said. "And you arrived tonight wearing—" He glanced briefly, without unkindness, at the ash-colored dress. "This." "My stepmother selected it," I said. "I assumed as much." Another silence. A torch guttered in a draft from somewhere and steadied again. "Why did you ask for me?" I said. The question arrived before I could evaluate whether it was wise. In the hall. There were 24 daughters of noble houses tonight, all of them presented and prepared and performing, he said simply. I closed my mouth. "Every person in that hall tonight," he said, turning to resume walking at the same measured pace, "was performing something. Loyalty, or wealth, or eligibility, or threat. It is what these gatherings are designed to produce. I have attended 11 of them." He glanced sideways at me briefly. "You were the only person in the room who was not performing anything at all." I considered this. "I was standing near a candle stand trying not to be noticed," I said. "I know. That's what I mean." We had reached a set of heavy oak doors, the entrance to the eastern chamber where the private meetings would be held. 2 royal guards stood at attention on either side. Orion paused before the doors and turned to face me fully. "I would like you to remain in the castle tonight," he said. "Not as a guest of the Corveth household, as a guest of the crown." The hall. The dress. Lady Corveth's face somewhere behind me in that crowd. All of it receded suddenly into a different distance. "That would require Lady Corveth's agreement," I said carefully. "No," he said. "It would require mine." The simplicity of it was almost dizzying. I had spent 11 years inside a system where every decision about my life passed through Lady Corveth's hands first. What I wore, where I slept, how I was introduced, whether I ate before or after the household's actual family. And here was a man saying, "No, actually, it requires mine." As though the system I had learned to survive were simply a local custom he was choosing not to observe. "Why?" I asked again, and this time I meant something larger than the hall, larger than the dress. I meant all of it. He was quiet for a long moment. The torchlight caught the lines at the corners of his eyes, those marks of campaigns and difficult decisions I had noticed earlier. And for just a moment, behind the composed certainty of a king who has long since stopped needing to explain himself, I saw something else, something quieter and considerably older than authority. "Because," he said finally, "I have spent 11 years making decisions based on what is politically sound and strategically correct, and I have become very good at it, and I am extraordinarily tired of it." I looked at him. "You are not what I expected to find tonight," he said. "I would like the opportunity to understand what I did find. If you are willing." It was the "if you are willing" that undid me. Those 3 words dropped so precisely into the sentence, so plainly meant, that I felt the banked fire move for the first time in longer than I could easily remember. Not a rage, not even a warmth, simply a shift. The coals turning over. Something underneath beginning to breathe. "I'm willing," I said. He nodded once, with the gravity of a man who understands when a simple thing is not simple at all. Then he turned to the nearest Gamma Guard. "Send word to Lady Corveth that her ward will be accommodated by the Crown for the remainder of the evening, and will be returned to the Corveth household tomorrow by royal escort." A brief pause. "With documentation?" The guard moved immediately. Orion looked back at me. "Come," he said. "There are meetings I must conduct. You may wait in the eastern antechamber. It is warm, and there is food that is considerably better than what they put on the public table." I almost laughed. The impulse was so sudden and so genuine that it startled me. A small, bright thing moving up through all that careful flatness. "That is a compelling argument," I said, and something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The suggestion of one, like the first light before a sunrise commits to being morning. We went inside. Behind us, in the great hall, Lady Corveth received the message from the royal guard with an expression that those nearby would later describe, in careful whispers, as the precise look of a woman watching an 11-year calculation dissolve in an instant. Mira gripped her wine cup too tightly and said nothing. Selah, to her own visible surprise, felt something complicated move through her that was not entirely without relief. I did not sleep that night. Not from distress. Or not entirely. The chamber they gave me was small by castle standards, and enormous by every standard I had lived inside for the past 11 years. A real bed with a wool-stuffed mattress and 2 heavy blankets. A brazier burning low in the corner, filling the room with steady, reliable warmth. A pitcher of clean water on a table beside a bowl of dried fruit and soft bread that someone had thought to leave without being asked. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, still in the ash-colored dress, and looked at the room around me as though it might dissolve if I moved too quickly. Then I ate the bread and dried fruit slowly, and thought about the word irregular. I had always known, in the vague and unexamined way that children know things they are not yet equipped to process, that the transfer of my father's estate had not felt right. Lady Corveth had moved with a speed that, in retrospect, spoke less of grief management and more of prior arrangement. Within 6 months of my father's disappearance being formally recorded, the Western estate had been absorbed into Corveth Holdings, the household staff had been replaced, and I had been assigned a room adjacent to the laundry. I had been 9 years old. I had understood that something was wrong and had possessed exactly no tools to address it. But a king with access to campaign records had used the word irregular. And then he had said with documentation to his guard, in the same tone a man uses when he has already decided to look at something more closely. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling and made myself breathe evenly. In the morning, everything would require careful thought. Tonight, I allowed myself simply to feel the strange, fragile lightness of sleeping somewhere warm without having earned it through labor. 3 days passed before I saw Orion again. The royal escort returned me to the Corveth estate the following morning as promised. 2 mounted guards in the king's livery, which produced in Lady Corveth a silence more expressive than anything she might have said. She received me in the front hall with her composure fully assembled, and her eyes doing the work her voice was too controlled to perform. She did not punish me directly. She was too intelligent for that now. Instead, the household simply grew quieter around me. Mira stopped speaking to me entirely, which was, honestly, an improvement. Sela watched me sometimes with the careful, measuring look of someone revising an opinion they had held for a long time without examining it. I went about my work. I carried water and pressed linens and managed the kitchen stores. But something had shifted in the quality of my own attention, the way a landscape looks different after rain. The same shapes, but the light falling differently, revealing contours you had not noticed before. On the 4th day, a royal messenger arrived at the estate gate. He carried a folded document sealed with the wolf sigil of Alden Moore and addressed in a clean, formal hand, not to Lady Corveth, but to Willa, ward of House Corveth, formerly of House Arveth. Lady Corveth was standing 3 feet away when the messenger read the address aloud. I watched something move through her face that she controlled before it fully arrived. I took the document. I waited until I was alone in my room to open it. It was not a love letter or a proclamation or anything that would have satisfied the interpretation I suspected was already circulating through the estate's rumor channels. It was a formal notice, written in the measured language of Crown administration, informing me that a review had been opened into the transfer of the Arveth estate holdings 11 years prior, and that I was named as the concerned party with full rights to submit testimony and receive legal counsel from the Crown's appointed representative. Beneath the formal text, in different ink and a slightly less formal hand, "The Eastern Antechamber has better bread than the public table most mornings. You are welcome to present your testimony in person at your convenience. Oh." I read the postscript 3 times. Then I sat with it for a long while, feeling something unfamiliar working its way through my chest. Not hope exactly. Hope was something I had learned to manage carefully, to keep partial and contingent. This was something quieter. The sensation of being seen not as a problem to be managed or an inconvenience to be assigned a room near the laundry, but as a person with a name that preceded the one Lady Corveth had spent 11 years defining me by. Formerly of House Arveth. I had forgotten, somewhere in the accumulated weight of 11 years, that I had once been from somewhere. I returned to Castle Aldenmore 6 days after the gathering of moons, this time on horseback, a horse arranged by the Crown's messenger, which produced in Lady Corveth a second silence even more expressive than the first. The castle in daylight was different from the castle in candlelight. Larger in some ways, more human in others. The great hall was being cleaned when I arrived, servants moving through it with brooms and fresh rushes. The massive chandeliers lowered on their chains for the candles to be replaced. Without the crowd and the music and the formal weight of the gathering, the stone simply looked like stone, old and solid and indifferent in the way that genuinely old things are indifferent, having outlasted too many human dramas to find any single one remarkable. Dessa met me at the inner gate. "You came?" she said, with the tone of someone whose expectations have been met but who had not been entirely certain they would be. "You thought I wouldn't?" I said. "I thought Lady Corveth might find a way to complicate it." "She tried," I said. "She had a headache that required my attention for 3 hours this morning." Dessa made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but occupied the same emotional territory. "Come, the king has a full morning of council. border reports and a trade dispute from the northern houses. He asked me to settle you with the archive steward first. The estate records from 11 years ago are already pulled. I stopped walking. Dessa turned back to look at me. He pulled the records himself? I said. He asked the archive steward to pull them, she said carefully. The morning after the gathering, before the review notice was formally drafted. I absorbed this. He moved quickly. He moves quickly when he has decided something, Dessa said simply. It is one of the things about him that is simultaneously useful and alarming, depending on which side of the decision you're on. I thought about this as we walked through the inner corridor toward the archive chamber, a long, low room lined floor to ceiling with wooden shelves holding the rolled and bound records of decades of Crown administration. The steward, an elderly beta man with ink-stained fingers and the careful movements of someone who regards paper as more durable than people, had already arranged a selection of documents on a reading table near the window. I sat. I began to read. What I found was not simple. The Arveth estate transfer had been processed through a provision designed for emergency inheritance situations, cases where a lord died without a direct heir of majority age, leaving holdings temporarily ungoverned. Lady Corveth had applied this provision within 3 months of my father's disappearance being recorded, citing administrative necessity and the minor age of the estate's only blood heir, me. What the provision did not technically permit, and what the records showed had been overlooked or deliberately obscured, was its application to a case of disappearance rather than confirmed death. My father had not been declared lost. He had been declared missing pending confirmation, which carried an entirely different set of legal protections for his dependents and holdings. Someone had moved the paperwork through the administrative chain at remarkable speed. Several signatures were from officials who had subsequently been reassigned to distant postings. I sat with this for a long time, the archive room quiet around me except for the occasional soft movement of the steward restacking documents at the far end of the room. Then the door opened. Orion came in without ceremony. No guards, no formal entrance. Simply a man in a dark traveling tunic who had evidently come directly from a long morning of border reports and looked it. There was a faint line of tension across his shoulders that hadn't been there at the gathering, and his expression carried the particular quality of someone who has been making difficult decisions since before dawn and is now choosing to stop for a moment. He stopped when he saw my face. "You've read it," he said. "Enough of it," I said. He pulled a chair from the opposite side of the table and sat, forearms resting on the wood, looking at me with that complete document-reading attention. "I want you to understand," he said carefully, "that the review is genuine. It is not a gesture. Whatever the records show will be followed to its conclusion." "And if the conclusion is that Lady Corveth committed fraud?" I said. The word arrived flat and clean, the way words do when you have been thinking them for a long time in softer forms and finally let them be what they are. He did not look away. "Then the conclusion is that Lady Corveth committed fraud," he said, "and the Crown acts accordingly." I looked at my hands on the table. The redness from cold water had faded in the past week. I had not noticed until now. "My father," I said quietly. "The records say missing, not dead." A silence. "Yes," Orion said. "I noticed that as well." "Is there any possibility?" "I have sent inquiries to the Northern Border Commands," he said, before I could finish the question, before I could expose how much weight I was putting on a single word in an old document. "I will tell you what they find, whatever it is." It was the whatever it is that steadied me, the willingness to include the hard version in the promise, to not offer comfort by narrowing the scope of what he was willing to say aloud. I nodded once. My throat was doing something I was managing carefully. "Thank you," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "How are you finding the bread?" I looked up. There was something at the corner of his mouth again. That almost smile, the suggestion of morning. "Considerably better than the public table," I said. And this time it became an actual smile, brief and unguarded, and entirely different from everything else about him. The way a window opened in a stone wall lets in more light than the size of the opening should reasonably allow. I felt the banked fire move again, deeper this time, and did not try to press it flat. Spring came to Aldenmoor the way it always does in the north, reluctantly, in pieces, a warm day followed by 3 cold ones, the snow retreating from the valley floors while the high passes held it still. The castle's inner courtyard began to show green along the stone edges, small and stubborn, the kind of growth that does not ask permission. I had been living within the castle walls for 2 months by then. It had not been an immediate transition. The Crown's review had taken the better part of 6 weeks, during which I had traveled between the Corveth estate and Aldenmoor 4 times, each journey a little less fraught than the last, each return to the estate a little more clearly temporary. Lady Corveth had understood before I did that the ground beneath her feet was shifting. I had watched it happen in the progressive tightening of her composure, that immaculate surface developing, for the first time in 11 years, the faint tracework of strain. The review concluded on a gray morning in late winter. I was in the archive chamber when Dessa brought me the formal summary, and I read it standing at the table because I could not bring myself to sit. The findings were precise and without embellishment. The Arveth estate transfer had been processed in violation of Crown inheritance law, using provisions that did not legally apply to the circumstances of my father's disappearance. Multiple administrative irregularities had been identified. Lady Corveth had been formally notified and had offered, through her legal representative, a full restitution agreement, rather than contest the findings before the Crown's Judicial Council. The Arveth holdings, the Western estate, the land, the legal standing, were to be returned to the direct bloodline heir. To me. I read that sentence twice, the way you reread something when the words are individually familiar, but their arrangement has not yet become real. Dessa was watching me from the doorway with her arms folded, and her expression carefully neutral, which I had come to understand was her version of deep feeling. "Well," I said, when I trusted my voice. "Well," she agreed. I set the document down on the table. Outside the archive's narrow window, a thin winter sun was making its best effort against a pale sky. "Is he?" I started. "Waiting in the eastern antechamber," Dessa said. "He has been there for the past hour. Apparently border reports are less compelling than usual this morning. Orion was standing when I came in, not at the table, but at the window, looking out at the courtyard where the first green edges were beginning to show along the stones. He turned when he heard the door. I held up the summary document. "I read it," I said. "I know." He had read it first, of course. He had read everything first, in the manner of a man who believes that delivering difficult or significant information to another person requires having processed it yourself. I had come to understand this about him over the past weeks. The careful way he prepared before he spoke, the way he never offered comfort that he could not make specific. "The restitution agreement," I said. "Lady Corveth agreed to it. She had no tenable alternative," he said. Not with satisfaction, simply with the precision that characterized how he spoke about difficult things. "Mira and Sella," I said. "The agreement. Does it affect their holdings?" He looked at me steadily. "You are asking about the women who made your life considerably harder for 11 years. "I am asking," I said. A brief pause. "The agreement addresses Lady Corveth's direct liability. Her daughter's portions are not touched by it." Another pause, slightly longer. That was not an accident. I understood him. He had structured it that way deliberately, knowing I would ask. The banked fire moved fully then, not the careful, managed shift I had been allowing it, but something real and wide, the coals fully turned, the warmth no longer something to monitor but simply something to be inside of. I crossed the room to where he stood at the window. We were quiet for a moment, looking out at the courtyard together, at the small green things growing along the old stones without asking anyone's permission. "The Northern Inquiry," I said. It was the other thing. The thing I had been holding carefully for 2 months, turning it over regularly but not pressing on it, keeping it partial and contingent the way I kept all hope. Orion turned from the window to face me. "The inquiry reached the Greyvein Border Command 3 weeks ago," he said. "The commander there is old enough to remember the third wave campaign." I waited. "Your father's company covered the retreat," he said. "Several men from that company were captured rather than lost. They were held in the northern territories for years. The border situation was too unstable for formal prisoner exchanges." He paused. 2 years ago, as part of a quiet territorial agreement, a group of long-held captives was released to the Border Command. My heart was doing something I could not manage or flatten or press into a smaller shape. "He is alive," Orion said quietly. "He has been living under the Border Command's care for 2 years. He did not know that the legal standing of his estate had been challenged or that you—" He stopped briefly. "He did not know your circumstances." I put my hand on the windowsill because the room had tilted slightly. "He is alive," I said. "Yes." The words sat in the room between us, simple and enormous, and completely resistant to any attempt to make it smaller. I had spent 11 years with a grief I had never been permitted to name because Lady Corveth had never officially acknowledged it as grief. She had called it circumstance. She had called it uncertainty. She had turned my father's absence into an administrative state that required her management. He was alive. I did not cry, exactly. Something happened in my face and my throat and behind my eyes that was adjacent to crying, but did not quite become it, the way a sky can be full of rain without it falling. Orion waited, with the patience of a man who has learned that some silences require nothing from the person witnessing them. After a while, I said, "When can I see him?" "A royal escort can depart within the week," he said. "I will go with you, if you want company on the road." I looked at him. He was watching me with that complete, unperforming attention, and something in it was different now from the first night in the Great Hall. The same quality of focus, but warmer at the center, the way a fire is different when it is no longer banked. "You would leave the castle for this?" I said. "I would leave the castle for this," he said simply. "There are border reports. Dessa can manage border reports," he said. And there was something so dry and certain in it that despite everything, despite the tilted room and the enormous words still sitting between us, I felt the impulse to laugh arrive again. That small, bright, genuine thing. I let it come. And he watched it. And the almost smile became a real one. And I thought that there was something in the quality of his expression in that moment that I would carry with me for a very long time. We rode north 6 days later. The escort was small. 4 royal guards. Dessa insisting on coming despite having loudly complained about roads in early spring, and the 2 of us at the center of it, riding at an easy pace through a landscape slowly deciding to become green. Orion was different on the road than in the castle. The composed, measured quality was still there, but looser, the way a held breath becomes breathing. He spoke more easily, about the territories we passed through, about the histories of villages we stopped in for water and rest, about the campaign routes his father had used in a different generation's wars. He asked me questions and listened to the answers with the same completeness he brought to everything, and I found myself speaking about things I had not spoken aloud in years. My father's voice, the smell of the Western Estate's kitchen in autumn, the particular quality of light through the windows of a room I had not stood in since I was 9 years old. On the 3rd evening, we stopped at a border inn, a low stone building smelling of wood smoke and barley soup, and sat across a rough table from each other while Dessa attempted to teach one of the guards a card game he was very bad at. "Can I ask you something?" I said. You have been asking me things consistently for 2 months, he said. I don't know why you would start requesting permission now. Fair point, I said. The night of the gathering, you said you were tired of decisions that were politically sound and strategically correct. I did. Was asking for me. In the hall, in front of everyone. Was that politically sound? He considered this for a moment with complete seriousness. No, he said. It was the opposite of politically sound. Half the noble houses in that room had daughters they were presenting specifically for my consideration. Publicly singling out an unrecognized ward in a damaged dress was, from a political standpoint, a significant miscalculation. Then why? Because, he said, I had spent the entire evening watching people perform, and then I saw you standing near an iron candle stand looking at the room as though you were reading it, and there was something in your face that was... He paused, choosing carefully. Completely honest. And I had not seen anything completely honest in a very long time. He looked at me across the rough table. It seemed worth a miscalculation. I held that for a moment. Orion, I said. His name, directly, the first time I had used it without a title, and he noticed, his attention sharpening almost imperceptibly. What happens when we get back? The estate review will be formally closed, he said, your legal standing restored. You will have options you did not have before. The Western holdings, your father's name, your own household. That's not what I asked, I said quietly. A silence. No, he said. It isn't. He looked at me across the rough table in the firelit inn, with Dessa's card game providing a comfortable noise in the background, and the spring wind moving outside against the shutters, and the road still ahead, and the road already behind, and said, I would like to ask something of you when we return. Formally, and in front of witnesses, and with full knowledge of what it is and what it means. He paused. But I think you should see your father first. Some things should happen in the right order. I looked at him for a long moment. That is either very patient, I said, or very certain. Both, he said simply. I have found they are not mutually exclusive. My father was standing in the doorway of the border commander's hall when we arrived. He was older than my memory of him, which was only reasonable. Thinner. He had a careful quality to his movements that spoke of years that had required carefulness. His hair had gone from dark to mostly gray at the temples, but his eyes were the same. I had my mother's face, people used to say, but I had his eyes. He saw me across the yard and stopped moving entirely. I crossed the yard at something between a walk and a run, the undignified gait of a person who has waited 11 years and is no longer interested in composure. And when I reached him, and he put his arms around me, it was not like something recovered, but like something confirmed, a truth that had been true all along, waiting underneath all the years of managed grief for someone to finally stop moving the paperwork long enough to find it. We stood there for a long time. Behind me, I heard Dessa say something quiet to the guards, and the sound of boots on stone moving respectfully away, and then the courtyard was simply wind, and my father's voice saying my name with the careful wonder of someone who had also been doing the long work of waiting. The formal asking happened 2 weeks after we returned to Aldenmore. In the great hall, the same stone floor, the same iron chandeliers, though this time they burned in daylight, not candlelight, in front of the assembled council, and my father seated at a table near the front, with the slightly dazed expression of a man still recalibrating his understanding of what his life had become. Orion stood at the edge of the dais, and spoke with the directness that characterized everything he did. He did not dress it in political language. He did not frame it in terms of alliances or administrative advantage. He said that he was asking for my hand because I was honest when honesty cost something, because I asked about Mira and Selah's portions before I asked about my own, because I had kept a fire burning inside myself for 11 years in a household that had given it no fuel, and he thought that was the most remarkable thing he had encountered in a very long time. Then he looked at me and said, "If you are willing." Those 3 words again. That small, precise space where the answer lived. I thought about the ash-colored dress hanging in a trunk somewhere in the Corveth estate, and the copper clasp, and the iron candle stand, and the archive room with its old records, and the road north in early spring, and a doorway with my father in it, and a rough table in a fire-lit inn, and the word both. "I am willing," I said. We were married in midsummer. My father walked me across the great hall's pale stone floor, his steps still careful, his shoulders a little straighter than they had been at the border post. Dessa stood at the side of the dais with her arms folded, and her expression doing its work of containing deep feeling. Lady Corveth was not present. The restitution agreement had been honored in full, and she had retired to a smaller holding in the eastern province, and that chapter had ended in the quiet, administrative way that some chapters end. Not with fire, but with paperwork, which is often more permanent. Mira had sent a brief, correctly worded letter of congratulation. I had written back with equal correctness and genuine goodwill, because I found, to my own mild surprise, that the 11 years had not produced in me any lasting appetite for bitterness. They had produced other things: patience, watchfulness, the ability to read a room, the habit of keeping a fire banked, that had turned out to be worth considerably more. Sella had written separately, in a less correct and considerably more honest letter, saying that she was sorry, and that she hoped I was happy, and that she had recently told her mother for the first time what she actually thought about several things, which had been terrifying and worthwhile in equal measure. I wrote back to her the longest response, and meant every word. On the evening of the last day of summer, I stood at the window of the high chamber that had become mine, ours, looking out at the courtyard where the green things had grown fully into themselves along the old stones, no longer small and stubborn, but simply present, as though they had always been there, and the winter had been the interruption rather than the truth. Orion came in from a late council meeting and stopped beside me at the window. "Border reports?" I said. "Resolved," he said. "Dessa is insufferably good at them." "She knows," I said. He looked out at the courtyard with me, at the last of the summer evening light moving across the stone. After a while he said, "You are thinking about something." "I am thinking," I said, "about the word irregular." He was quiet. "It was the first thing," I said. "The thing that told me you had actually looked, before the hall, before the review, before any of it. You had already looked at what happened to my father's estate, and you had already found the word that fit it." "Yes," he said. "Why?" He considered for a moment. "Because you were standing in a room full of people who had been given every advantage and were still asking for more, and you were standing at the edge in a dress that someone had deliberately made worse, and you were watching the room with the careful attention of someone who has spent a long time learning to see without being seen." He paused. "That doesn't happen without a reason." And I wanted to know the reason. I looked at him. "You were paying attention before I even noticed you were," I said. "I was," he said simply. Outside, the last summer light moved across the courtyard stones, and the green things held their ground with the quiet certainty of things that have earned their place. And inside the chamber there was nothing more that needed to be said. Only the steady warmth of 2 people standing together in the good, unremarkable peace of an ordinary evening, which is not ordinary at all when you have spent long enough without it. My father was 2 days' ride away in the restored Western estate, which was being put slowly back to rights by a new steward, and the accumulated patience of a man who had survived years of difficulty and emerged on the other side with an understanding of what mattered. Dessa was somewhere below us winning at cards. The kingdom of Aldenmore held its borders and its old stones and its tapestried walls and its centuries of difficult decisions, and it would go on holding them. And I, Willa, ward of no one, daughter of a living father, formerly of House Arveth, and now of something larger, stood at the window of a high chamber in the last light of summer, with the banked fire fully open at last, and let myself simply be warm. That was how it ended. Not with fire or proclamation, or a final enemy defeated in a public square. With warmth, and a window, and the particular quality of peace that only comes to people who have carried their fire carefully through a long cold, and finally, arrived somewhere worth burning brightly. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.